Really, Catherine may have been more significant in shaping what the Salvation Army is as a movement than William, who was the front evangelist, spokesman, raconteur, storyteller, whereas Catherine is in there peddling like crazy, doing the hard thinking and the hard yards, and herself was a unique personality in Victorian England, somebody who is very significant in the history not just of the church, but in the history of modern feminism. All of these things we're going to try and scatter across or skirt across in the next little while. So we begin today acknowledging Catherine, and we're going to dig a little deeply and see if we can find out something of who she was and why the insights she have become so seminally important and in need of renewal today in a movement like the Salvation Army. How significant was the impact of the Salvation Army in 19th century Britain and around the world, and how critical to that Salvation Army understanding and its rapid growth around the world were the insights of Catherine? Well, here's one way of approaching it. They are just a few examples of films about the Salvation Army shot between 1896 and 1950. Central to all of them is one figure, the Salvation Army lass, as she was called. The impact of the Salvation Army in 19th century Western society was about women. It was about the full equity of women in every aspect of life. And Catherine Booth is responsible for that. Catherine Booth created what became this revolutionary radical movement called the Salvation Army because of her radical insights through reading the Bible, but most importantly, understanding the Bible in the context of the world in which she lived. She didn't just take the scriptures and say, this is what God said. She says, this is what God said. How do I understand that in the world in which I live? How do I make sense of that in my world? And she was doing that from her youngest years. She was precociously bright, but had an affliction which in some ways proved to be an advantage. Let's take a look at a little bit of Catherine Booth's life and the way this image of the woman gets reflected through the history of the Salvation Army. That's an image of Catherine's daughter, Evangeline. It was taken about 1907, 1908. And there she is, reflecting in many ways what in the Catholic tradition you'd see that as Mary or the guardian looking after the children, the mother figure, husbanding the children, caring for the children. That image of the caring woman, Evangeline Booth, Catherine's daughter in this case, when she was leading the Salvation Army in the United States around the turn of the 20th century, around 1904, 1905, became one of the most successful posters in Salvation Army history. I'll just go back and give you a look at that poster again. That was in 1918, just after the First World War, and 1919. It was that photo of Evangeline becoming a poster that swept the United States. It turned up a few months later when a Salvation Army lass was the cover figure for Cosmopolitan magazine. Where did this come from? It came because the Salvation Army expressed itself in World War I in the United States through sending not men as chaplains, but women into the trenches in World War I, and they became known as the Donut Girls. And people were just shocked. How can they do this? The Donut Girls changed the way women were perceived in America in many ways. Catherine began a process that resulted in the Salvation Army becoming the image that it has. As late as, that's a shot taken during 9/11. The Salvation Army, again, women out dispensing tea, coffee and everything else. The figures on the other side are from just a few years later, Hurricane Katrina in the United States. There, the amount of meals and beds the Salvation Army gave out in the first week following Hurricane Katrina. That movement has to a large extent gained its motive power through the Salvation Army's attitude to gender equity and to women in need. And this is where we get the origins of much of what Catherine had to say and understand. She looked at the way the world was, the way people experienced it. So we'll go on a little journey now. We've seen the contemporary impact. There she is as a young woman. She was born in 1829, the same year as her husband, William, and together they had both independently become members of the Methodist Church, but then members of a rather radical edge of the Methodist Church called the Methodist New Connection. And the Methodist New Connection formed about 100 years after mainstream Methodism as a way of trying to establish two things about Methodism. One, to take it back to its original roots, its original Wesleyan roots with John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, but also to express something else about Methodism, that the church was more than just the local congregation. The church was a universal thing. We were all members of a thing called the Church Universal as Christians, who were members of the Church Universal. Why was this important to them? Because both of them, through the Methodist New Connection, had felt the church was becoming too settled and people were happy sitting in their own local congregations, and they needed to recognise that they were connected to each other. That this wasn't just an isolated thing you did on your own. So strong was this connectional view in this denomination that called themselves the Methodist New Connection, and so strong was their feeling about responsibility for their neighbour that in the town of Huddersfield in England, they were called the Tom Paine Methodists. Does anyone know who Tom Paine was? Tom Paine was an English writer who wrote a pamphlet in the 18th century called The Rights of Man. The Rights of Man became the most important pamphlet in the American Revolution, then the French Revolution. It was the first advocacy of equality, equity, justice, democracy, if you like. And the New Connection Methodists are in the town of Huddersfield in England were known as the Tom Painers, the Tom Paine Methodists. This is a tradition which both William and Catherine independently joined as young people. There was something else going on in England at the time that this young woman was growing up. Born in 1829, in 1832, England passed the first Great Reform Act, the first Act of Parliament which began to give rights to ordinary people. That had come after a long struggle. It came because after what were called the Napoleonic Wars, the wars against Napoleon and the French ended in 1815, Hundreds of men, thousands of men came out of the forces. There was lots of unemployment. You had industrialisation starting to take place and factories growing up, people moving off farms. So you get congested cities and towns, lots of unemployment. There were no unemployment benefits. And people began to say, hang on, the world isn't working the way it should. And agitation began for change. So the 1832 Reform Act is passed. William and Catherine grow up in this atmosphere. William, as a young man, was a supporter of one of the great radical movements called the Chartists. And the Chartists were people who fought for the vote, fought to get ordinary people to vote. There were, I think, 32 points in the Charter, and William Booth, one of his, the people who write the story, the early histories of the army, say that William Booth as a young man was a blood and fire Chartist. That if he was a young man, he could have got a gun as a Chartist, he would have held the rifle higher than anybody else. That he was really enthusiastic for social reform. So you get a young, fiery evangelist in William Booth who was committed to ordinary people. He'd come out of poverty himself. Catherine, much the same. They meet in the new connection, fall in love, get married. But she's already thinking there as a young person. Now here's one of her lines. She was a great sermon giver, and this is typical of the lines that she used to come up with. If we are to better the future, we must disturb the present. That's a classic Catherine line. We can't be settled with things. Together they worked as evangelists within the Methodist tradition. But they were so successful in a way that they began to disturb the tradition. And at one point it's recorded that early in their marriage, working with the new connection, the local Methodist Assembly met to basically put a rein on William and Catherine, their extensive evangelical activities. And when a motion was put to the floor of the meeting that William's ministry be constrained, Catherine was heard to shout from the gallery, "Never!" And they both exited the new connection to become independent evangelists. During this time, Catherine was also thinking about the place of women in the church. And there was a visiting couple from America, Phoebe Palmer and her husband, and Phoebe Palmer had actually begun to preach to preach in some halls and churches around, and she was known around the world as a female evangelist. Catherine was very impressed by Phoebe Palmer. The other thing, though, that she did was she didn't just listen and watch Phoebe Palmer, she actually thought about what Phoebe Palmer was doing. And she wrote a pamphlet on female ministry. Now, we're talking about an era here where women were not to be seen in church, you know, you should wear your head covers and be silent in church. Catherine thought it through as a young person, and I said earlier she had a great advantage that was given to her by an affliction. As a young girl, as a teenager, she began to develop curvature of the spine. And she was quite frail and spent a lot of time in bed. But that actually fed her appetite for books. She read the Bible through and through. She read books. She read history. She read theology. She was a sort of naturally bright and precocious child. So this prepared her in a way for her life because she understood suffering, she understood difficulty, but she also understood how to meet the challenges. She now sits down and confronts one of the great issues that have kept women back. That is, what is the place of women according to God, according to the New Testament? And she writes a pamphlet called Female Ministry. And she basically argues out of St. Paul, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, nor bond nor free. And says, well, hang on. How do I reconcile what Paul is saying there against the other statements Paul makes about the way women should be seen and not heard and other things? And she argues it through. But she's doing more than justifying why Phoebe Palmer can talk in churches. She's actually saying something quite deeper. She's actually saying, no, there is no reason why women cannot have authority, that women are radically equal. And this is something that in the 1850s was an extraordinary challenge. I mean, women didn't get the vote in England for another half a century. So you're talking about 50 to 60 years before women even get the vote that she is writing this stuff. It was a bit of a challenge to William, actually, because he was forced to actually think about this. And eventually he became a supporter and was one of the ones who encouraged her to actually, when the time came and she decided she was ready, to get up and speak in church. From that moment she became one of England's most requested speakers, in or out of the church. She was good at it. I think she'd be mentally preparing herself. So that's the intellectual side of Catherine. She also had this practical side, which was expressed in the way she took up issues. And the first issue that we see her publicly identified with came partly as a result of her understanding the conditions which prevailed in the England in which she and William came to view as their own patch of turf. William and Catherine both had this innate sense of social justice, which I've outlined. They found themselves in the East End. William had a speaking engagement in the East End of London that he'd accepted. It actually came, incidentally, according to some, through the fact that Catherine had previously been invited to do some talks in a church community not far out of London. So William came down to London and then he accepted an engagement to go into the East End. The story goes that after coming back from his preaching duties one night and going past pubs and brothels and other places, he gets back to Catherine and says, "Darling, in passing all of these places and seeing humanity in and out of these places, I think I found my destiny." He'd found those people who needed him most. Now, Catherine, in some ways, had already prepared the way. Because this is the year 1865, when Catherine and William found what's called the Christian Mission, or the East London Mission, in 1865. The year before, 1864, Catherine had got heavily involved in fighting for changes to what was called the Contagious Diseases Act. And this was the beginning of her journey into some of the dark places. The Contagious Diseases Act came to Catherine's attention through this woman here, Josephine Butler. Josephine Butler was a high Anglican woman, high church Anglican, but also committed to women's role and women's life in the church. She was a feminist, a proto-feminist, if you like, described in her youth as the most beautiful woman in England. And she had the stories of numerous dukes and counts wanting to whisk her away and make her their bride. But she was committed to the uplift of others. Catherine met Butler through work over the Contagious Diseases Act, through Josephine Butler's work on the Contagious Diseases Act. What's that, you say? Well, it stemmed from an event that had taken place just a few years before, when, if anybody can recognise that painting, it's a painting of a famous British battle that took place in the Crimean War. It's the charge of the Light Brigade. As a result of that war, hospitals were set up, and a person who has become famous worldwide for the work in those hospitals was this person, Who's that? Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale found that a lot of the illnesses coming into those hospitals wasn't actually through wounds, it's through soldiers outside of the barracks getting STDs. When they came back to England, sexually transmitted diseases were higher in the British Army than almost any other army in Europe, higher than the French, higher than all the others. Because the British Army had this rule that only a certain percentage of soldiers in a regiment were allowed to be married. Therefore, most of them were condemned to be bachelors. And what do? Well, they have to satisfy their urges some way. Now, the Contagious Diseases Act set up to try and deal with STDs. Now, you didn't have medical therapies to do it, you had to do it by law. What did the law do? It set out to criminalise prostitution. How did it criminalise prostitution? It criminalised the prostitutes. It criminalised the prostitutes, not the procurers. So the guys dealing out the money weren't the guilty ones, the women were the guilty ones. Josephine Butler got really upset about that. Catherine got really upset about that, and Catherine joined Josephine Butler in fighting for changes to the Contagious Diseases Act. They are arguing in 1864 that guilt in this situation, if it's going to go anywhere, should be with the procurer, not with the woman, who by dint of the dreadful circumstances they may find themselves in, are reduced to selling their bodies for sex. That argument still has to be made in some parts of the world, in lots of parts of the world, that the burden of guilt, these are really very radical thoughts at this time in a society which still women were legally in Britain regarded as chattels of their husbands. So Florence Nightingale, unintentionally, through trying to do the right thing, gets a Contagious Diseases Act, which has another set of negative consequences. Catherine joins in a fight for social reform. Now, this is interesting for a Christian evangelist, because Christian evangelists are supposed to just get your soul saved and put you in the heavenly lifeboat and up you go, and that's all right. You know, let the world be what it is. That wasn't her understanding of the Christian message. Her understanding of the Christian message is God, men, women are all radically equal before God, and we have a responsibility to build the kingdom of God here on earth, to make it as it is in heaven, and therefore my responsibility, argues Catherine, is to work with these sorts of things. Now, this is a bit of a shock to William because he's a traditional evangelist at this stage. William believes, as many good Christian evangelists believe, that your job as the evangelist is to save people's souls. Those people then, converted, become good people, they influence other people to be good people, and you change society that way. Catherine is doing something different. She's saying, no, 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 no. There are structures which carry sin with them. The structures help create the situation, so we have a duty, just as reforming people, to actually change the structures, to make the structures better. Whoa! William has to wrestle with this, and he wrestles with it for some years, because he has a strong sense of social justice, just as Catherine does, but he's wrestling with the means. Catherine and William, through the 1860s, work with the Christian mission till in 1878 it becomes the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army, again through Catherine, Catherine is two things. She's a radical Congregationalist, that is, she believes in the priesthood of all believers, that is, everyone, there's no sacred priesthood, we all have the power to communicate the message of God, but she also is a New Connection Wesleyan. That is, she believes that That doesn't mean we all have our local congregations. We should all be one in the church. So in their radical thinking, Catherine and William think, well, what's the best structure? If structures aren't sacred, what's the best structure? The most modern one they could find was a sort of military structure, because that gave everyone a place, everyone a job to do, and it also was universal. That is, everybody could be members of an army. This had been brought about in part too from local politics. Inside the Christian mission, William Booth was getting frustrated that whilst the mission was growing, you could find a problem with the people in Brighton didn't agree with the way the people in Holloway were doing things, and they would argue with the people somewhere else, and he was just going, and eventually he said, no, we've just got to start and get this show on the road. It can't be just like another settled little church where everybody does their own thing. It was a way in which they could see their social vision harmonising with their evangelical vision. There was a job to do in the world. In Australia, just after this time, 1878 becomes the Salvation Army, William and Catherine send out to Australia a newly married young couple. In fact, they had their honeymoon on the boat on the way over, James and Alice Barker. They are supposed to get to Adelaide, but a shipping strike forced them on to Melbourne. And Barker writes in his diary, "Press against us, public against us, God for us." He's a bit of an optimist, and they're only in their 20s. But it was really interesting the way he approached his task. Yes, he was an evangelist. 12 months after they arrived in Melbourne, they booked the Melbourne exhibition, the largest building in the Southern Hemisphere, for their first anniversary rally. Such was their optimism in filling the building. They even had a band that they'd helped prepare for the occasion. They'd been teaching these guys to play. But when the band members actually got up on the stage and saw the size of the crowd, they scurried off. They got stage fright. So something was working in James's favour. They'd got a big crowd. How did he do it? How did he and Alice do it? Because they were there as commanders of the Salvation Army in all the colonies of the Southern Seas. Well, it comes through something of that vision that had been imparted by Catherine. The week before he has his big anniversary rally, he's outside the Melbourne jail saying to prisoners, "You got a bed for the night? You got somewhere to stay?" And internationally, the Salvation Army marks the beginning of its organised formal social work from the work of James Barker here in Melbourne, in Carlton, in 1880. I've got to say James and Alice Barker, because wherever you see James doing things, you see Alice doing something of the same sort of thing that Catherine was doing. This is a beginning of a DNA that's spreading. James is welcoming prisoners. Alice is putting a note in the press to say, if any mothers are concerned about their lost daughters or children, please contact us at this address. And families would knock on the door at night, and James and Alice would go down into the brothels of Melbourne looking for the lost girls of Melbourne and bringing them home or just seeing how they were. This was so successful that the work of James and Alice, the word about their work, began to spread rapidly. And the army grew very rapidly. It grew more rapidly in Victoria, particularly around Melbourne, than almost any other place in the world for a few years. And I've got the figures, I won't bother quoting them now. But Melbourne had a very interesting layout. Because of the grid of the city, you've got Parliament House, as you know, at the top of the city. Just across the road are the glories of the Princess Theatre, one of the great theatres of the Southern Hemisphere at the time. But if you look just there, that's the beginnings of Little Bourke Street. If you went down Little Bourke Street, there were the classy brothels at the top of Little Bourke Street, and as you walked down Little Bourke Street, it got towards Chinatown, so the brothels got seedier and seedier and seedier. That was the turf that James and Alice worked. So successful were they that, and the army was growing so rapidly, that international headquarters, William Booth himself began to notice this. The figures were coming out, this is amazing growth. So he sends out to Australia his number 2 son, Ballington Booth, called the Marshal. So the Marshal comes to town. The Marshal Ballington Booth arrives in Melbourne and he's looking for why James and Alice are so successful. Now, if you've got an international religious leader coming to town, what do you think you're going to do? Because James Barker was very successful to the extent that the Victorian government had already recognised his work. Ballington's assistant writes in his diary when he sees what Barker is doing, "Oh, my Salvation Army, what's happened to you? The rich of the land, politicians eating your words." Can't understand it. So what does Barker do with Ballington? He takes him down Little Bourke Street into a brothel. And he has Ballington sit at a piano in the brothel playing the girls their favourite songs and having a sing-along. This is demonstrating to your international leaders what it's all about. This is something of the success of James and Alice. They were walking with people. Walking with people. The Salvation Army eventually bought that block of land there and built a multi-storey building on it that became known as Spring House. And it was a women's hostel and refuge. And it stayed there until the army sold it in the early 1970s, I think. It was sold. But the reason it was on that corner, I think, were 2 reasons. One, because Little Bourke Street was, the entrance to the trade, but just across the road's Parliament House. So the parliamentarians could know what's going on also. Alice and James worked together as a team, but they worked for and with people. And I think that story about Ballington Booth going into the brothel, Ballington tells it himself, and it's published in a book called The Salvation War 1883, that Ballington writes this report about his visit to Australia and this remarkable encounter with the Barkers, James and Alice, and what they were doing in Melbourne. We shall move on a little. These are the sorts of brothels that Alice was visiting in Melbourne. That's a picture from, it's a Melbourne picture. I know it's sourced in Melbourne. I don't actually know where it was taken. Alice's work with James continued to be extraordinarily successful right through the 1880s up to 1890. In the late 1880s, there was a great recession in Australia, and their work became even more valuable and more appreciated, particularly as they were working, as I said, at that top end of Bourke Street, very close to Parliament House, and they became very friendly with people in government. You find often notes, if you go back to the period, and you find this recognition of the Salvation Army and its work in Melbourne, unlike other places around the world. For some reason, the Salvation Army just clicked with Melbourne as a town. Now I want to introduce you to a new character, a man who, W.T. Stead his name is. This is back in England. And he, in the 1880s, also had an encounter with the Booths. And it was over the issue of women. W.T. Stead was a Congregationalist. He was also a journalist, a bit of a hero of mine actually. He was a radical journalist. He believed in social reform and social justice. And he was the editor or a journalist at a paper called the Northern Echo up on Tyneside in England, around Newcastle and that area. He was working in a little town called Darlington, and it was a mining town. He's writing for the paper up there. William Booth sends into Darlington 2 young women to bring the Salvation Army to the rough miners of Darlington. Stead was shocked to the core. He immediately writes to William Booth saying, "How dare you, as the general of an army, send young women, only aged 19 and 21, I think they were, to a town like this? This is just utterly dangerous. How can a general do this to his troops?" William Booth writes back a letter that says, "If you're a general, you must be willing to expend your troops, even if it comes to the point of losing them in battle." Well, I don't think Stead was expecting that reply. He was expecting he wanted William Booth to be sort of protective of these young women and apologise for sending them into such a desperate place. So Stead begins a correspondence with William Booth, then with Catherine Booth and the others, and eventually he becomes one of the army's greatest supporters and a great supporter of Catherine. He became very, very close to Catherine over the years. We introduce him here because his life and Catherine and William's life intersect through a number of issues. I've already mentioned Josephine Butler and the Contagious Diseases Act. Well, Stead happened to be a friend of Josephine Butler as well, being a journalist, and by the time he got to London, he became a very well-known journalist in London, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, which was one of the big-selling papers of London. Here you get a sense of what Stead was objecting to, seeing women placed in a position where men could abuse them. And Stead, I think reasonably from the point of view of the time, is saying, hang on, you just cannot put women in these positions. The reply of Catherine and William is that women are the best people to go into these positions. Another person of importance here, I'm sorry that that's bouncing forward. Another person of importance here around this time, the mid to late 1880s, is Florence Soper. She's a convert to the Salvation Army, eventually marries William's #1 son, Bramwell. Florence, in 1888, opened the first women's refuge in London and was put in charge of them. She maintained that as her personal cause for the rest of her life. Even when her husband, Bramwell, succeeded William as general, she kept her link to that. By the time she eventually retired, close to the end of her life, there were over 130 refuges that she'd established, and the army was operating around the world of the larger sort that she was responsible for. She pops up once or twice again in this story, but it's again how this DNA is communicated. Catherine's understanding gets communicated to other women who then share it with others, as William was doing also. The reason that Stead and people like Florence Soper, or as she became then Mrs. Bramwell Booth, become important to our story is another big campaign. This one had to do, again, with sexual exploitation. It's known as the Maiden Tribute Campaign. And this was probably the most sensational British tabloid story of the late 19th century. It had to do with the fact that child prostitution was rampant in London in the 19th century. It was just accepted. I know. Poverty-stricken families would sell their children into brothels when they were 12, 10, 12. The age of consent was so low that it really didn't matter. Catherine was angered by that. Another person we've met before who was angered by that was Josephine Butler, a little older by now, a more mature woman, married, had her own children, still a vigorous campaigner through the Anglican Church, and she had links to the Catholic Church as well. They banded together with the help of W.T. Stead as a journalist, who thought up what's really become, I think, the first newspaper sting operation. He said, we can expose this whole trade by setting up a brothel or a front for a brothel and seeing what happens. So they got a woman who was a reformed brothel keeper called Rebecca Jarrett, and for this they enlisted the support of a number of others, a committee which was chaired, or not, perhaps not chaired, but certainly had as its member the Roman Catholic Cardinal Manning. These are Protestants and Catholics talking to each other. This is another big first. Cardinal Manning, and organised by Bramwell Booth. This is Florence Soper's husband, Bramwell Booth, Catherine's son. Stead says to them, look, if you pull this off, I'll publish the whole thing. So what we'll do is we'll get Rebecca Jarrett, this brothel keeper, we'll put her in a shop front, and she'll be a procuress. She'll procure. So we'll make sure the word goes out, and I, Stead, will be there in the room recording all this. I'll hide in the cupboard and record everything that happens. So they organised it this way. Rebecca Jarrett did the job, a couple came in, sold their young girl to Jarrett. Stead's furiously writing it all down, either under a table or in a cupboard, somewhere in there. He's writing it all down. The girl is then taken to another room. She's led down the back steps to a Salvation Army matron who immediately takes her down to Dover, and they put her on a ferry across to France, to a Salvation Army hostel in Paris or in France, so that she's safe, absolutely safe. Stead then publishes it in his book, in his magazine, the Pall Mall Gazette. Such is the sensation in London under this heading, Maiden Tribute in Modern Babylon, that the young George Bernard Shaw races down to Stead's office, grabs as many copies of the newspaper as he can and goes and helps sell them on the street. The society, particularly upper class society, is in uproar. And here's an example of one of the meetings called as a result of this, and you can see the names of the key people here. Protection of Young Girls, Thursday morning, July 14th, at the Prince's Hall, Piccadilly, addressed by Mrs. Booth, Mrs. Josephine Butler. There's a few other worthies there. The most important thing here is Samuel Morley, Esquire, MP, will chair the meeting. Morley was heavyweight. Morley was not only an MP, he was a leading publisher. He had weight. If people like Morley were getting behind this, look out. And it succeeded. They succeeded in having the law changed. The age of consent was raised. Young girls were protected. There's wonderful, colourful illustrations in this story. I won't go into the details now about how they got a petition and how they got it into Parliament, all sorts of other things. But what proved almost their undoing was this. Some newspapers found out that the whole operation was a sting. It was an artificial creation, that Stead had actually set up Rebecca Jarrett to do this operation, and they began to say this is a fraud. The whole thing's a fraud. So those who were profiting off this trade immediately struck back, and the big end of town struck back, and Bramwell Booth, Rebecca Jarrett and W.T. Stead were charged. Brought to law, Bramwell Booth got off because he wasn't in the room when the exchange had taken place. Rebecca Jarrett was charged and went to jail, and Stead was also charged and went to jail. Now notice in all of this I haven't mentioned William Booth once, because William had nothing to do with any of it. It was Bramwell and Catherine with Stead who were the motor engines of this. Why? In part because William is still wrestling with this problem about whether this is an appropriate way to go, to do public campaigns to change legislation. He's still sort of struggling with this idea. The person who publicly stood up for the Salvation Army and for Stead, while others on this committee that they'd had abandoned them, was Cardinal Manning, the Roman Catholic Cardinal. And as a result of that, Bramwell Booth began to establish a relationship with Cardinal Manning. So here's the radically Protestant Salvation Army, and the son of their leader, having cups of tea with the Roman Catholic cardinal on a regular basis. Stead was so grateful to Cardinal Manning that he almost regarded Cardinal Manning as a surrogate father from then on. And Catherine and Bramwell maintained these good relations external to their organisation, the Salvation Army, right through their lives, as did William eventually. Stead, poor Stead. Well, he enjoyed going to jail. There he is in his prison clothes. And there he is 30 years later in his prison clothes. Every year he'd put on the prison clothes from 1885 right up to the year he died in 1912, just to prove that, you know, I can still wear them. When he was in jail, he wrote a number of letters from prison, and his daughter Estelle collected them. And one, I think, is particularly powerful. And there's just one line in it. He said, you can go, he said, if Jesus came back, he'd go in and out of church after church, and he'd see all these people giving praise to Christ, singing hymns to Christ, giving all the glory to Christ. And then Jesus would walk out of the church and wander down some back alley and see a poor girl who was having a bitter cry, put his arms around her and say, come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It's the greatest danger to Christendom is those who call themselves his own people. Never tell anyone to be a Christian. Always tell them to be Christ.